name is Ian, and Martha and I have been hosting these literary events once a month for, I don't know, she says 4 years. It feels like 20. Anyways, a couple of announcements. May 7th, which is tonight, open mic with Troy Youngblood, and we're going to be featuring Dan Stevens. This is all the stuff that's going at the Blueberry Patch. May 11th will be open jam with the Blueberry Patch Ramblers. May 22nd is the band Bliss Ed and the Divine Derelicts. June 1st will be open mic again with Troy Youngblood. And the 4th, which will be our John Steinbeck feature here at Boca Bay. Also, I want to remind you, it's a $5 donation to keep this wonderful organization running. And I'd like to also thank Boca Bay GRILLE for allowing us to be here, and also the Blueberry Patch. And I'm going to just give you a quick read on what and who that is. Anybody know what that is, the Blueberry Patch? Everybody? They all know? Oh, good. Well, then I don't have to go into that whole spiel. But it's all about sharing, and that's essentially what this is all about, is sharing our knowledge and hoping somebody will open up a book or a Kindle or whatever other item is. So again, we're going to be doing alternates. So the first person up is going to be Allison Solomon. Speak up. There's no mic. The mic is for our video.
Got it. Hi, I'm Allison Solomon, and I'm going to be reading from Along Came the Rain, which was published by Sapphire Books in 2016. And actually, I'm very proud to say I just recently got notified that it's a finalist for a Goldie Award. So, So Along Came the Rain is about Wynne, a middle-aged woman who's been accused of kidnapping 2 foster children, and she's out to prove her innocence. The novel has 3 narrators: Wynne, her partner BOCA, and Callie, a foster child. So I'm going to read from the prologue, which has an anonymous narrator, so that readers hopefully spend the book wondering who that anonymous narrator is. So I'll start from the prologue, and then I'll be reading from Wynne. Well-intentioned, that's what those birth moms are, the ones who won't let their kids be adopted by some do-gooder middle-class strangers. Year after year, they try to get off drugs, give up the abusive spouses, and get themselves permanent jobs so they can provide a stable home. Sometimes they succeed for a while, and the kids come home. Then something happens, and they fall back to worrying more about where they'll score their next hit than who's hitting on their daughters. They remind me of Claude, a cat I used to own, who would catch a bird in its mouth, drop it, play with it until it was half dead, and then walk away. I know the drugs are to blame, but it's the kids I feel sorry for. While the politicians and activists argue about mothers' rights versus children's rights, nothing changes, and the kids get chewed up in the system until they end up in the same sorry situation their moms were in. Enough is enough. Someone needs to do something drastic, and that someone is me. It won't be pretty, and a few people may have to suffer along the way, but it'll be worth it. You'll see. So here's Wynne on June the 22nd. It's raining when they arrest me. Not a light New England drizzle, but a heavy Florida summer downpour, the kind that creates puddles in seconds and floods in minutes. As the 2 police officers hurry me out of the front door and down the drenched flagstone path, I have to keep myself from slipping on the wet ferns and sodden scarlet hibiscus scattered in the storm. Barker looks like she's in shock. She keeps repeating in a low voice, "I'll get you out of there," like a Buddhist mantra. Poor Barker, she must be beside herself with worry. It all happened so quickly. One minute, we're sitting in the living room watching a rerun of one of our favorite episodes of Friends, the one where Ross finds his red sweater. The next, Barker answers the door to two uniformed police officers who tell her they need to take Wynne Larimer down to the station for questioning. I don't know who was more shocked, her or me. I could understand being arrested if I'd committed a crime, or if I knew someone who had, or if I were connected in any way to any kind of criminal activity. I could comprehend it if I had a hidden past that had finally caught up with me. But I've been a model citizen from the time I was a straight-acting kindergarten teacher in my 20s to my current status as a middle-aged suburban jewelry-making lesbian. She's on Aricept, Barker yells at the officers as one of them pushes down on my head, shoving me into the patrol car. It's very important she doesn't miss a dose. She thrusts a prescription bottle at the male cop, but he holds up his hand and says he isn't allowed to take it. My memory medication is the least of my worries right now. The AC blows harshly on my wet legs and arms as I shiver in the back of the cruiser, shaking out my dripping, lanky curls. When we arrive at the police station and they bundle me out of the car, I ask what I'm being charged with. The mean cop mumbles contemptuously, "Like you don't know," while the younger one says, with almost a hint of sadness in her tone, "We're just arresting you. We don't have to bring any charges yet, but if we do, it will most likely be for false imprisonment." False imprisonment? Isn't that what you're doing to me, I want to ask? But it doesn't seem like a good idea. When I used to visit Mom in the nursing home, half the ladies there would tell me they'd been kidnapped and were now falsely imprisoned. I hardly want to sound like one of them, but I've never imprisoned anyone in my life. Why would they think I have? Who did I imprison? The next part is a blur, but I know it involves being photographed and fingerprinted and repeating my name and address several times. Then they tell me I'm going to a holding cell. I can barely bring my feet to move as a large-boned officer walks me down the corridor. We pass cells that have no doors, just metal grates from top to bottom, where you can see everything the women in the cells are doing, slouching on their cots, shitting on the toilet. A young woman in a red bustier, black leather shorts, and boots that come up to her thighs yells, "What did the old lady do? Rob Medicare?" I'm offended that she thinks I'm old, but I feel grateful for my age when we stop at a cell that has a proper door with just a small metal grate in it that they can pass food through. There's a metal toilet in the corner and I sit down on it, my whole body aching. I can feel the arthritis in my hips starting up, and if I have to sleep on that mattress in the corner, which looks more like a yoga mat, I won't be able to move by tomorrow morning. I want Barker. I want a lawyer. I've read about upright citizens who committed crimes with the Black Panthers or the Symbionese Liberation Army in their youth, who finally get caught when they're middle-aged, but I'm not one of them. And yes, I get them as bustier and black boots might not categorize me as middle-aged, but when she gets to be my age, I guarantee she'll no longer think of 59 as old. I keep going back to that idea of false imprisonment. Who could I have imprisoned? The only people I know of who are kept somewhere against their will are either spouses, and clearly Barker's at home, so that's not it, or girls who go missing and are forced into sex work. Barker has two clients who are missing right now, 15-year-old foster kids who disappeared when they were being transferred from a foster home over a week ago. She's voiced her fears several times that they were abducted and are being kept somewhere. Could it be them? Do the police think I had something to do with their disappearance? That makes absolutely no sense. Which brings me back to the thought that went round and round in my head while I was shivering in the police cruiser. Someone has set me up. Thank you.
I had failed to mention that today is Female Writers of Florida, and I really appreciate all of the lovely ladies who've come out and to share with us. I know there are several events going on today, and it's wonderful that all of you are joining us. Next would be Tracy Berg. And I'm sorry I don't have any bios on these wonderful ladies, so maybe they could give their name and maybe a little something.
Hi, my name is Tracy Bird. I'm a local author and editor, and I'm going to read a story today called The Dress. And it's a story that I submitted to Writers in Paradise in 2013, and it was actually published in 2014 in their literary journal. Not a lot of, you're going to hear the whole story, maybe 10, 11 minutes. So there's not a lot to tell you other than this is a story about a young girl whose family moved from Mexico to Tucson, Arizona when she was very young. It's called The Dress. At first, the dress was just a bag of beads and seed pearls and a roll of white taffeta Tia Perla spread out on her kitchen table. I don't need a pattern, she told me, so I drew a dress with a lot of lace and a long train on the back of an old Tucson electric power envelope. Braulio wanted me to have a store-bought dress. He thinks they are better than something homemade, but I said no. When I asked Tia Perla to make my dress, she said she doesn't make dresses anymore. I cried, she cried, and then she said she would do it. When I told Mommy about the dress, she said, Dios mío, and put her hand over her heart. Papi says I'll be sorry in the long run. About Perla and the dress and the wedding and Braulio. I can be married and still go to college, I remind him. He reminds me I am already not in college. Always I have thought of Tia Perla, my father's sister, as my other mother. My own mommy was an orphan, raised in a convent in Mexico. She's a very traditional Mexican woman. She never goes out without her rebozo. She doesn't drive or speak any English. She turns to Papi for everything. Sometimes I think he even tells her what to feel. Perla says Mommy is the kind of woman who needs to be married. And she says it in a way that makes me understand we're not that way, Perla and I, and also that it is not the best thing to be. From Mommy, I have learned to cook and clean. She has raised me to be a dutiful wife. Everything else I have learned from Perla. What to wear, how to style my hair, how to act around boys. It was Perla who came when I was in trouble in school, and Perla who told me about my family, how it was when she and Papi were little in Mexico. Papi doesn't like these stories, and he won't answer if I ask him about them. I don't know where that Mexico came from. I'm sorry, let's just say Mexico. Papi always says it is a low-class thing to park your car in your yard, even if your yard is just crusty yellow dirt. Let me try again. I'm losing my focus here. Papi always says it is a low-class thing to park your car in your yard, even if your yard is just crusty yellow desert sand, like all the yards in South Tucson. On the day Braulio came to my house to meet Mommy and Papi, he parked his El Camino in our front yard, right next to the ceramic statue of Our Lady, the Virgin of Guadalupe. When he opened his door, it hit the Virgin and knocked her face down in the hard dirt. Mommy rushed out to rescue her from the ground. Her feet had broken off, and a piece of her face was missing too. Braulio looked like a man at a funeral as he followed Mommy to the backyard, the Virgin cradled in his arms. Later that night, after dinner, after Braulio went home, I watched and prayed as Mommy buried the Virgin in the backyard near two others and our dog, Pepe. The next day, a new Virgin appeared in our front yard, and Papi was studying how to keep her standing no matter what hit her. When Perla and Papi were kids, they lived in Jalisco, Mexico. They were very poor and did not even have store-bought shoes until they were old enough to have jobs. Perla was the oldest. Their mother, my abuela, had Perla, and then 3 babies that died, and then Papi. Abuela worked selling pottery in the village, so Perla was left to care for her little brother. One day, when he was 1 and she was 6, he wouldn't stop crying. He was hungry, but there was nothing to eat. Perla got angry and took her eyes from him for only a second. And when she looked back, he was gone. She found him in the dirt by the side of their house with a bitch dog and her puppies. Papi was down with the puppies, taking milk from the bitch. Perla did not stop him, only sat by the wall of the house and watched. He fell asleep with the puppies, and still she only watched. A long time ago, before Papi called Perla a drunk, before her baby died and Tio Carlos, her husband, moved to Nogales, Perla was a seamstress. Mommy says she made the best quinceañera dresses in Tucson. They looked like giant layer cakes covered in pastel taffeta foam and sparkling with tiny crystal beads. Things happen to people, Mommy says, when I ask about Perla and why she is a drunk and no longer a seamstress. She hangs her head and says only that things are better now that Perla and Papi don't speak. 5 years ago, Papi called Perla a drunk and slapped her face, but he knows I see her every day. When Papi is not home, Mommy says someone has to look in on Perla. When Papi is home, Mommy says nothing at all. Sometimes Papi talks about Perla. He says he is sad to have lost his big sister. Also, he is angry. Mommy says he is ashamed of Perla. He says she is a bruja and someday will move to another house, so he doesn't have to see her tossing empty vodka bottles into the back of her truck at her house across the street. Papi doesn't know what she does with the bottles, but I do. She drives to Mexico and gives them to Carlos for the mezcal he makes in his bathtub. According to Papi, the only job Carlos can keep is selling booze to the cabrones in Nogales. Also, he says Carlos is a drunk, just like Perla. Perla says Papi doesn't know anything and should keep his nose on his side of the street. The Mexican border is only 65 miles south of Tucson, but I have been to Mexico exactly once. When I was 4, Mommy and Papi took me to meet Papi's mother, my abuela Maria Hernando. What I remember best from that trip is the smell of hot diesel from the trucks waiting in line to cross the border, and the way the tiny houses on the hills looked wavy in the heat from the road. Abuela Maria was a very old woman when we went to visit. She cried when she saw Papi. Later, she died, and we never went back. Perla's husband, Carlos, is an American, but he lives in Nogales, and Perla goes to visit him. She won't take me with her because Papi would be angry. Flora, she tells me, you are an American. Don't be too excited to run off to Mexico. It is not such a nice place. The Mexico Papi talks about sounds different from Perla's Mexico. His Mexico is beautiful, full of quiet, obedient daughters and wonderful things to eat. Papi thinks I am too modern, too loud, too brave. I am only American, I say. We came to the U.S., Mommy and I, to give you a better life, he says. This is the better life, I tell him. I have shoes. I think Perla knows I'm pregnant. The first time she measured me for the dress, there was nothing to see. But yesterday, she measured me again and said my waist is bigger. I told her I drink a lot of beer with Braulio, but I don't, because of the baby. I think she believed me because she knows beer makes your stomach fat. That's why she drinks vodka. If Papi knew about the baby, he would say, I'll kill him. And he might. But for now, this is a quiet secret between me and Braulio. Tia Perla says she is happy for me about the wedding. Once she told me I should be careful, that maybe I only like Braulio because he is a bad boy. And according to her, I am always a good girl. Mostly she is right about me, but mostly she is wrong about Braulio. I met him at the Voice in the Desert Catholic Church. He came from LA to live in Tucson because his father was deported. His father knows there is too much trouble for a young man to get into in LA, so he sent him to Tucson to live with his sister. Papi sniffs when I talk about Braulio's family. Maybe he thinks he and Perla and Mommy are the only poor and hungry people who ever wanted to come to the U.S. When they came in 1971, they had only a line to walk across. Perla says it's not that Papi doesn't like Braulio. It's just that I am a citizen, and Papi worries because Braulio is not. Tio Carlos is a citizen, and you married him, I say. That's not the same, Perla says. I know Braulio loves me, and I know he is happy about the wedding. When I told him about the baby, he only nodded. But he is a quiet man. Again, I am standing before Perla in my panties and bra, my arms raised. Perla lifts the dress over my head. It settles on my shoulders, and she begins to pull the small-waisted lace bodice down my body. She clucks her tongue, just like Poppy does when he is worried. I lower my arms, trying to help her stretch the fabric across my belly, but it just won't go. Ay, Florita, Perla says. She puts her arms around me, hiding her eyes, and then crosses them so she is holding her elbows. Mija, you shouldn't drink so much beer, she says, and tries again to pull the cloth across my belly. Then she says, take it off, take it off. Suddenly I am ashamed, standing almost naked in front of my tia, who used to change my diapers, who sat on the toilet and guided me the first time I shaved my legs. She picks up her tape measure. We'd better clean up this mess before the wedding, she says. I smell the vodka on her breath as she wraps the plastic tape around my belly. On the Saturday morning of the wedding, I ride to the church in Braulio's El Camino, squished between him and Perla. The dress is in my lap. Braulio's friends are in front of the church when we arrive, and already they are drinking beer. Braulio parks the El Camino and jumps out to join the celebration. Perla follows, pulling a bottle of vodka from her bag as she goes. I'm left alone in the car, under the dress, waiting and watching as Perla fills a cup and toasts the groom. When it comes time for me to put my dress on, Mommy wants to help Perla and me. I stare at the floor so she can't see my face as I step out of the clothes. In the end, it's the dress that tells her, not my belly. When she sees how the dress was changed, the gussets sewn in it to make it bigger, her eyes widen. She falls into a skinny dressing room chair with a moan. She crosses herself and chews the lipstick from her lips. Perla turns white and reaches for her cup. She's been back outside to the truck many times. Perla lifts the dress over my head. The dressing room is quiet except for the crunch of taffeta. Every second is as long as Easter Sunday Mass until Poppy knocks at the door. Mommy closes her eyes and I hear Poppy say, 5 minutes, then the crack of his hard-soled shoes on the stone floor as he walks away. As Mommy watches Perla fasten the tiny white buttons that march up the back of the dress, she takes off her pearls. These are yours now, she says. She strings them around my neck. Go with God. She kisses my cheek. When the dressing room door opens, I hear the chatter of guests and Elvis Presley singing the Hawaiian wedding song. Mommy is the first to go out. She takes Poppy's arm. You are beautiful, Perla tells me and empties her cup. She is next to leave. Ahead of her, Mommy and Poppy have stopped. Mommy leans close to Poppy's ear. I can see her mouth move, but I can't hear her words. I'm lifting up my foot to step into the aisle when Poppy turns towards me. His face is as white as a tortilla. Suddenly, I am very, very scared. He raises his arms and bellows, "Embarazada! Embarazada!" There is a sound like wind in my ears, and my feet can't find the floor. Poppy yells again, and still I can't find the floor. All the sounds in the church, the music, all the people's voices, and Poppy's move away from me like a train in a tunnel. The last thing I remember is collapsing in a puddle of taffeta. When I was a tiny girl, and Poppy talked about all the things I would do when I grew up, Perla would tell him, "Those are tiny shoulders." She will be an American. She will go to college and make money and take care of the family, Poppy would say. Now he knows how small my shoulders really are. Now I will be a mother and not even married. When Perla and I left South Tucson, rumor was that Braulio vanished after Poppy chased him from the church, waving a gun that one of the guests gave him. Braulio's friends thought he would go back to LA or maybe even Mexico to his father. I didn't know what he would do, but I do know that he had 2 days to come back for me. He didn't. Tia Perla and I, we live with Tio Carlos in Nogales now. I sleep in a room on a small bed, which I will soon share with my baby. Under the bed in a white box is my wedding dress. Leave it behind, Perla told me, but I couldn't. It is the very dress I always wanted. I know I'll wear it someday. Poppy told Perla and me to leave South Tucson and not come back, ever. In South Tucson, he told me, you are a puta. But in Mexico, you can be a grieving widow carrying your dead husband's child. We'll see what I say when I meet a man with interests. The baby is due any day. Tia Perla says I must stay close to the house because the baby could come at any time. In Mexican Spanish, I am embarazado, embarrassed, an embarrassment. Every night, I pray to the Virgin that the baby is not a girl.
Whoop. Uh-oh. Thank you very much, Tracy. So this person I do know a little bit. Her name is Lynn Taylor, and she writes for our local newspaper, The Gabber, and she's been so fantastic to us, and so I'd like to bring her up. And also, if you want drinks or food, Tiffany is our server, and she's absolutely fantastic. So, Lynn.
Hello. I brought a story to read, but I'm going to read works by two female authors who I really admire. The first one is Adrienne Rich. According to the Poetry Foundation, poet and essayist Adrienne Rich was one of America's foremost public intellectuals. Widely read and hugely influential, Rich's career spanned 7 decades and has hewed closely to the story of post-war American poetry itself. Her earliest work, including A Change of World, which won the prestigious Yale Younger Poets Award, was formally exact and decorous, while her work of the late 1960s and 70s became increasingly radical in both its free verse form and feminist and political content. Rich's metamorphosis was noticed by Carol Muskie in the New York Times Book Review, who wrote that Rich began as a polite copyist of Yeats and Auden, wife and mother. She has progressed in life and in her poems from young widow and disenchanted formalist to spiritual and rhetorical convalescent to feminist leader and doyen of a newly defined female literature. So this poem I'm going to read is called Power, and I thought since the March for Science was very recent that this might be appropriate. Power. Living in the earth, deposits of our history. Today a backhoe divulged out of a crumbling flank of earth. One bottle, amber perfect, 100-year-old cure for fever or melancholy. A tonic for living on this earth in the winters of this climate. Today I was reading about Marie Curie. She must have known she suffered from radiation sickness, her body bombarded for years by the elements she had purified. It seems she denied to the end the source of the cataracts on her eyes, the cracked and suppurating skin of her finger ends, till she could no longer hold a test tube or a pencil. She died a famous woman, denying her wounds came from the same source as her power. This passage is from The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich. She was born in Little Falls, Minnesota. As the daughter of a Chippewa Indian mother and a German-American father, she explores Native American themes in her work with major characters representing both sides of her heritage. In an award-winning series of related novels and short stories, she has visited and revisited the North Dakota lands where her ancestors met and mingled. representing Chippewa experience in the Anglo-American literary tradition. Many critics claim Erdrich has remained true to her Native ancestors' mythic and artistic visions while writing fiction that candidly explores the cultural issues facing modern-day Native Americans and mixed heritage Americans. An essayist for contemporary novelists observed that Erdrich's accomplishment is that she is weaving a body of work that goes beyond portraying contemporary Native American life as descendants of a politically dominated people to explore the great universal questions, questions of identity, pattern versus randomness, and the meaning of life itself. In addition to her numerous award-winning novels and short story collections, Erdrich has published 3 critically acclaimed collections of poetry. And I have to say, this is probably one of my favorite passages ever in literature, and this is from The Roundhouse. I must supply these words for myself. Life will break you. Nobody can protect you from that, and living alone won't either, for solitude will also break you with its yearning. You have to love. You have to feel. It is the reason you are here on earth. You are here to risk your heart. You are here to be swallowed up. And when it happens that you are broken or betrayed or left or hurt or death brushes near, let yourself sit by an apple tree and listen to the apples falling all around you in heaps, wasting their sweetness. Tell yourself that you tasted as many as you could.
So my next guest, of course, as you'll see, he's not a female Florida writer, but he's going to read some wonderful little ditties from the Sand Hill Review, which is their publishing house out of St. Leo University here in Florida, and Eckert Review, I believe. So I'd like to invite Rob up. And by the way, Rob has been crucial to our organization. And of course, he's a great local writer and author and poet and playwright, and I don't know, the list goes on. So, Rob?
As Ian says, I am not a woman. So I feel really odd being up here to read today, but thank you for the opportunity to read. I'm going to read a couple of pieces from the Sand Hill Review for starters, and then maybe later on, if I have more time, I'll come back and read something else. The first piece I want to read is by Amanda Butler, called The Oracle and I. In the beginning, I was an oracle. My eyes rolled back as I landed, and I found myself in 2 holes. Hallways, always, doors, columns of doors, dragons, crags, dark sea foam, time faces, keys and stains, drops and crumbs, enough to change. What is the sanity of a hat's ribbon? Kissing those lips could make anyone tipsy for a fun house. Searching in his eyes, in my eyes, have you ever heard of a lost oracle? In the end, I had seen. Thank you. The next piece, Carol G. Walker's Adventure Awaits. The blue dot has disappeared. The GPS has no signal. I am driving, but no electronic voice tells me to turn or to keep straight. Lost, without a signal or a hope, on a highway to nowhere or somewhere, depending on your perspective. And how many of us have had that happen? Okay, and the last piece I'm reading is by Catherine Regal, It's called Waking, and it starts with a quote from the Theodore Roethke. What falls away is always. My dog is deaf now, so when I leave the room and she is sleeping, I must touch her to wake her so she knows where I've gone. If I don't, she runs from room to room looking for me, her nails clicking on the wood and going silent over the carpet, so she disappears to me, as I have disappeared during her dreams. And neither of us knows where the other is. Precisely, and loneliness lands in the house, black wings lodging in our throats. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I believe we also have another guest whom I've not met. Her name is Sandy. Okay. So while we're waiting for our writer to come up, do any of you have any questions about what we do here?
It seems apparent that you read works after original by someone else. Are these only women writers in this?
Today, yes. Today. Like I stated, next month we'll be hosting the late, great John Steinbeck.
I'm a friend of Rob's. He invited me.
Oh, wonderful.
Did he leave?
I think he went to the restroom.
Well, he's heard this poem before. See me.
Okay. Kurt is going to come up and we're going to jostle some
Readjust?
things around and
Thank you.
just to let everybody know that the mic is actually for our purposes. What we do later with all of this stuff, we tape this and it goes on our YouTube page and so on and so forth.
You have a YouTube page?
Yeah. Yeah. So this is not a mic for the room to hear, but next time we'll have something like that. Okay, Tim, go ahead.
Well, I'm Sandy, and Rob invited me to this event. And this is just a short poem I wrote, and this actually happened to me.
Sandy, can you speak up a little bit?
Can I bring that close? Is that better? Or not? Okay, well, let's go. It's called Crumbs in Her Cleavage. She found crumbs in her cleavage, leftover blueberry muffin, raising them to her lips, savoring their flaky sweetness. Looking down once again at her moist cleavage, she pondered her breasts, producing life's first nourishments to her babies, a resting place for a sleeping child. Perky in their prime, turning heads during construction site catcalls. To the delight of her husband, they danced in loving privacy. Trainers, sports, push-ups, maternity housed them over the years. She mourned with her friends who lost theirs, ever so grateful that hers had now settled in the season of sage wisdom, a moment of life-affirming gratitude, all because she found crumbs in her cleavage. Thank you.
Okay. So, I'm going to ask Allison to come back up and read. Allison, just a brief little bio. Gave me the privilege of looking at her book, Along Came the Rain. She grew up in England, lived in Israel and Mexico, now a resident of the great state of Florida. and published author, obviously, and former clinical social worker. But there was a quote in her bio that I thought was very interesting, and it says she's not on any national or international wanted list, just because of, although I think she should be, and being the deviant that she is, or the terrorist that she is. Anyhow, please, Allison.
So I'm going to read an excerpt from my second novel, which is called Devoted. And part of it takes place here in Gulfport. And I'm going to read an excerpt from the end of the first chapter of Devoted, which is a suspense novel. It starts when Ashley receives a call from JP, her sister Lizzie's wife, telling her that Lizzie is in the hospital dying. Lizzie had previously been diagnosed with a kidney condition, but it wasn't considered to be that serious. Ash is shocked and jumps on a plane rushing to Philly, where JP picks her up and takes her to the hospital. JP drops her off and goes to park the pickup truck while Ash rushes to her sister's side. I run through the double doors and follow the signs to the elevators. A desultory group of people is waiting, and now that I'm so close, I'm too desperate to see Lizzie to wait. I push open the small door next to the elevators, take the stairs 2 at a time, pull open a heavy door onto the second floor, and head towards the nurse's station. A plump, middle-aged woman, whose afro frames her face like a halo, asks how she can help. When I tell her who I am, she looks relieved and hurries me down the hall. Inside Lizzie's room, it's hard to believe the woman propped up in the hospital bed is my sister. Her skin is yellow, and she's so bloated, she reminds me of one of those blimps that hover in the sky, encouraging me to buy their brand of insurance. An oxygen mask covers her nose and mouth, and an IV snakes itself around her arm. Her eyes are closed. I tiptoe over and stand at the bedside. "Lizzie," I whisper, and stroke her swollen fingers. "Lizzie?" I don't know if she can hear me, so I take a chance and say loudly, "It's me, Ash, your sister." Her lids flutter, and for a moment she opens her eyes. Her gaze is blank, and she closes her eyes again. Through the plastic of the oxygen mask, the corner of her mouth turns upward as if she's trying to smile. I squeeze her hand, and she grimaces. "I love you," I say. "Darling, darling sister, I love you so much." I clench my throat tight to hold back a sob trying to make its way out. My hand is in hers, and she tries to lift it. I'm not sure if she wants to kiss my fingers, but the effort is too much, and her hand falls back. I lean forward and kiss her forehead. Maybe she wants to say something. I move the oxygen mask away from her face. She opens her mouth, but no sound comes out. She swallows and tries again, gasping for air. I lean forward to replace the mask, but she shakes her head. "JP," she whispers, and I feel my heart constrict. I thought she'd be happy to see me. Apparently, the only person she wants next to her is her wife. "She's coming. She's parking the truck." She shakes her head with surprising vehemence and opens her eyes. They're no longer glazed or blank, only full of agitation. She's trying to get a sentence out, but it's barely a mumble, and there are only a couple of words I can catch. "JP, affair, Jim." JP had an affair with a guy called Jim? It's about the most unlikely thing she could tell me, and I wonder what drugs they have her on. I stroke her hand, her forehead, any part of her I can touch. "Whatever happened, we don't need to talk about that now, honey. It doesn't matter." "No, me," she gasps, then continues, "JP, mad." Is this a deathbed confession? While I can't believe JP would have an affair with a guy, it's hard to imagine loyal, dependable Lizzie having an affair with anyone, female or male. "Sweetheart, none of it matters. We're both here for you. We love you. She's parking the truck. She's not mad at you." Not now, then. She sucks in all the air she can, then forces out a string of words, mumbling and incoherent. I told her, hell and in the water, no energy, drink, gym, but I wasn't. Lizzie, honey, I don't understand what you're trying to tell me. I'm sure it doesn't matter now. She's clearly exhausted, fighting for breath. I put the oxygen mask back over her nose and mouth. Did I hear her say the word hell? Is she saying she's going to hell? I know she gave up her faith, but now that she's dying, is she clinging to it? I wonder if there's a chaplain or pastor here. Even though Lizzie says she's no longer a Christian, she might want someone to pray with her and help her go home to God. I want to ask her, and yet she's already so upset and agitated, I don't want to make things worse. Does she understand how serious her condition is? Shall we pray together? I stroke her hand. With a strength I would never have expected, she rips the mask off her face. Ash! Her eyes, so empty a few moments ago, are burning fiercely. Yes, my sweet sister, She cuts me off. JP! I turn, thinking JP is by the door or has come in. She hasn't. Lizzie's eyes grow wide and frantic. Jim! Again, something I can't make out, and then a word that sounds like prison. Jim is in prison? She shakes her head and pushes out the word one more time. It still sounds like she's saying prison, yet I know it's not quite that. Her mouth moves, but nothing happens. All of a sudden, she slumps. Her eyes roll backwards, and all the machines she's attached to stop beeping frantically. A nurse yells, "Code Blue," and there's a flurry of activity. I know it's too late. I've watched enough TV to know what it means when the machines show flat lines. Lizzie's chest is no longer rising and falling, and I can feel death in the air. Lizzie! I spin around. JP stands in the doorway, stunned. She rushes into the room, but Lizzie is now surrounded by medical professionals pumping on her chest, blowing some sort of balloon into her mouth, and JP can't get near her. There's silence while the medical team works on Lizzie, and I hear the words, "Time of death." JP looks around in bewilderment, chokes up and bursts into tears. She slides down onto the floor and I slide next to her. All I can think is that my sister is gone forever. I'm completely alone in the world. How can this have happened? How can my beloved sister, so healthy until last month, be dead? Lizzie's last words echo over and over in my brain. Jim, prison. All of a sudden, in the midst of my grief, the word comes unbidden into the forefront of my brain. Poison. She wasn't saying that Jim was in prison. With her dying breath, my sister was trying to tell me that someone named Jim had poisoned her. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. So again, I have invited another gentleman to read, and this guy I've known for a short period of time, but he's just fantastic. And so anyways, Michael Guittard. He's going to be reading something from the Sandhill Review out of University of St. Leo.
Hello. This poem by Catherine Regal. It's called Waking. A little something ahead of the poem here. What falls away is always, by Theodore Rothke. My dog is deaf now, so when I leave the room and she is sleeping, I must touch her to wake her, so she knows where I have gone. If I don't, she runs from room to room looking for me, her nails clicking on the wood and going silent over the carpet, so she disappears to me as I have disappeared during her dreams, and neither of us knows where the other is precisely. And loneliness lands in the house, black wings lodging in our throats.
Okay. Lynn? And as you know, I've already stated, Lynn writes for the Gabber, great supporter of ours, has a fantastic husband. I don't know. What else is there?
I don't know. I think that covers it. Thanks, Ian. Okay, I entered a short story contest for Keep St. Pete Lit for their Sunlit Festival, and I was fortunate enough to win an honorable mention for this story. Thanks. With the prompt, he or she walked away without so much as a backward glance. So this is called The Day Alan Shepard Died. Talk louder, okay. She walked away without so much as a backward glance. The irony of the last sentence of my novel, a fictionalized version of growing up on Florida's Space Coast, was not lost on me as my daughter and I drove across the Melbourne Causeway, squinting against the sun. The book, a modest success, was published almost 5 years ago now, well after Amy and I were comfortably settled in a quiet rural neighborhood in the North Georgia mountains. The bridge we were crossing, twin spans surrounded on both sides by the Indian River, stretched from Melbourne to the town of Indialantic where I grew up. As we reached the apex, I caught my first glimpse of the Atlantic Ocean in the distance, glittering blue water against cloudless blue sky. No matter how many times I used to drive over that same causeway, the first seconds when the ocean came into view still managed to take my breath away. Amy looked over at me. "It's so beautiful, isn't it, Mom?" She rolled down her window, letting in a blast of heat. I reached the downside of the bridge, and the heavy salt air hit me like a slap in the face, a reminder why I was here in a town I swore I would never return to. I was here to sign the final papers selling my childhood home for my mother after the death of my father. My parents and my brothers moved to New Mexico the year I graduated from high school, but I stayed behind. I was beginning my first year of college, but I also couldn't imagine living somewhere that wasn't near water. I grew up 1 block from the ocean during the peak of NASA's space program. We had only to cross A1A, walk along a dirt path lined with Australian pines, and we were right at the edge of the Atlantic. When I was Amy's age, my father would take me way out beyond the breaking waves where we would float on our backs, contemplating the formation of clouds or a seagull squirrel. He would lift me above the crashing waves, but I was never afraid. "Are we going to see Granddad's rockets tomorrow?" Amy asked. She loved driving by the line of missiles on display in front of Patrick Air Force Base and could pick out every one my father worked on during his days as an engineer for the space program. "We won't have time this trip. You have school and I have to get back to work." I was annoyed at having to drive down this week when I was so busy, but I didn't want to stay in the area any longer than I had to. The summer I was 7, my father built a jungle gym out of steel pipe in the corner of the backyard for my brothers and me. It loomed like a fortress, and my brothers and I could climb to the top bars and see the ocean, or a bird's eye view of the box turtles and varieties of snakes that roamed through the thicket of palmetto bushes separating our street from A1A. Whenever there was a space launch, my parents would count down along with the telecast, then the whole family would rush outside to watch the liftoff, my brothers and I scrambling for the highest position on the jungle gym. Feeling the ocean breeze in our faces, we waited in anticipation for the first sight of the missile. 3, 2, 1, blast off, we chanted together as we competed to see who would be the first to see the speck of light that showed the rocket's position and who would see the last trail of smoke as the missile disappeared from sight. The year was 1961, and from those metal bars my family watched in awe as Alan Shepard became the first American in space. "This is history in the making," my father said. Even though we didn't understand the full meaning of his words at the time, we knew from the tone of his voice we had witnessed something important. I can miss one more day, Mom. Besides, we never get to come here anymore, said Amy, interrupting my thoughts. That was true. It was hard on Amy, but I felt I had no choice. I would always equate this town with my ex-husband, James. The long walks on the beach, the early morning swims, the lies, the betrayals. I moved as soon as my divorce was final, but the truth was, after I got some distance, I realized this town had started to close in on me years ago. As I turned into the old neighborhood, everything seemed suspended in time. On my right was the house that belonged to my best friend, Donna. Our house was at the end of Beach Street, which snaked through the subdivision. After dinner, every kid in the neighborhood would meet at a designated spot on our bicycles, trying to squeeze the last bit of fun out of the day before darkness fell. 3 doors down was Eddie's house, where I danced my first slow dance at a party with a boy whose name I've long since forgotten. But I would never forget the dance or the kiss as the Beach Boys sang of monster waves and surfer girls. By the time I became a teenager, I didn't want to go outside and watch the space launches anymore, but my parents and brothers unfailingly did. If you've seen one, you've seen them all, I had grumbled as I walked out to the backyard behind my family, hoping my friends weren't watching and could see how uncool we were. This is a piece of history that will never be repeated, something you can tell your children about someday, my father said. I rolled my eyes and tried to look as disinterested as possible. I pulled up in front of my parents' house and had barely put the car in park before Amy was out the door. We had been in the car since early morning and she had trouble keeping all that energy in for long. I smiled as I watched her run the length of the driveway and back. It had always been a matter of secret pride for my brothers and me that we had the longest driveway in the neighborhood. Every kid on the street would line up for our Saturday morning skateboard races. Standing on my skateboard at the top of the driveway, I would take off. The end of the driveway had looked a mile away, but looked much smaller now than in my imagination. As I got out of the car, Mrs. Carrera, who lived next door to us for as long as I could remember, ambled over. Growing up, I thought she was the most exotic woman I had ever seen. She wore her jet black hair waist length and loose at a time when all the other mothers had short salon-styled hair. She always dressed in bright tropical colors with an armful of silver bracelets that made a medley of sound when she moved. Nora, she enveloped me in a hug, her bracelets jangling, her hair still long but totally gray now. Memories of babysitting and backyard barbecues came flooding back. So did the whispers of my mother's friends as they sipped Manhattans and nibbled crustless finger sandwiches during their weekly bridge games. I heard she's working as an escort for the astronauts, if you know what I mean, Mrs. Dean hissed to my mother when Mrs. Carrera wasn't there. Probably why she couldn't make it tonight, said Mrs. Brown, getting up to fix herself another drink. My mother had glanced toward the kitchen to see if I or one of my brothers was around, but I was in my usual spot in the space under the stairs where I could see and hear everything. Mrs. Carrera released her hold on me. I was so sorry to hear about your father. We all sure had some great times together. How's your mother doing? Pretty well. I think she's going to be okay. Well, we've missed you. And how's my girl? She asked as Amy came scampering up. We're going to see Granddad's rockets tomorrow and maybe go to the beach, Amy said, looking up at me. I guess she figured if she said something in front of another adult, I would have to comply. Your granddad was a wonderful man, Mrs. Carrera said to Amy, always joking around. When they had the mass layoff at the Cape, the man worked 3 jobs. All the guys did, just to make ends meet. But your granddad always kept a sense of humor. By that time, the exhilaration of the space program was waning. Thousands of NASA employees were laid off. The country was in the midst of the Vietnam War. My father, a decorated World War II veteran, and I engaged in some heated discussions. You don't run away from your responsibilities, he had said when I defended the boys who were moving to Canada to avoid the draft, and my friends and I who protested the war. At 16, I knew nothing about the weight of responsibility. A red Cadillac pulled into the driveway. Hello, I'm Mrs. Welch, the realtor, said the overcoughed woman in a tight pink suit getting out of the car, and these are the Bradfords. The Bradfords got out of the car and stood blinking into the sun. They were blonde and pale and dressed in black from head to toe. No one would ever mistake them for native Floridians. Mrs. Welch told us your father worked for the space program during the 60s and 70s, said Mr. Bradford. We heard on the news this morning that Alan Shepard died. I didn't realize he was such a character, smuggling that 6-iron to the moon and driving golf balls into space. Yes, I said. I smiled, suddenly feeling a little unsteady. I hadn't listened to the radio on the drive down or read the paper this morning. I remembered standing outside the officers' club with my family and throngs of other people cheering as Alan Shepard, John Glenn, and the other astronauts paraded by after each successful mission. Mr. and Mrs. Bradford just want to do another quick walkthrough, Mrs. Welch said, unlocking the front door. We won't be long, said Mr. Bradford. They looked grateful to be indoors. Amy and I went to the family room while Mrs. Welch and the Bradfords walked from room to room. I hadn't been inside for years, and everything seemed suspended in time. The large kitchen where my parents hosted parties that usually resulted in my mother waking up with a headache on Saturday mornings. The family room where we gathered to watch the first appearance of the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. The back door where my brother threw a salad outside for the dog when we were allowed to eat on the couch and watch TV. The dining room where the whole family gathered around the table as our father told us he had a job offer in New Mexico and the family would be moving right after the school year ended. Amy opened the back door and headed straight for the old jungle gym, still standing after all this time. The bars are made of galvanized iron, my father had said. That means it's protected from the elements. You'll always have it. I thought I would always have my father and James too. No matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't think of anywhere to run to this time. Now Alan Shepard dead. The space program had been a source of national pride, the last vestige of innocence in a nation torn apart by assassinations, civil rights, Vietnam, Watergate. The astronauts had always seemed larger than life, as had my father. They were the heroes of my childhood, part of the glue that bonded my family memories. What heroes would my daughter have? From the window, I saw Amy swinging from the highest bar, just as I did when I was her age. Well, the rooms are a little small, I heard Mrs. Bradford say. We wouldn't be able to entertain like we're used to. And we definitely have to clean up the backyard, maybe put in a deck and a hot tub, said Mr. Bradford. Amy was sitting on the highest bar of the jungle gym. The breeze had picked up, blowing her hair across her face. Sometimes I still had dreams about the beach that were so real I could taste the salt and feel the heat of the sun on my skin. I took a deep breath and walked into the living room. I'm rejecting your offer. I've decided not to sell. But the contract, protested Mrs. Welch. I've decided to keep the house, I said. After they left, I opened the back door and walked outside. The sun was just starting to set in a blaze of color that streaked across the sky. I took off my heels and climbed to the top of the old jungle gym and joined my daughter. I could still see the ocean, though not as clearly through the maze of condominiums and hotels that now overpowered the coastline. We sat up there for a long time, Amy swinging and me thinking about our future that I had once again so impulsively altered. The first star came out, reminding me of the glow from the night launches I had witnessed out here with my family. I stood up and faced the ocean, breathed in the heavy salt air, and watched the white tips of the breakers offshore. Feeling the warm breeze in my face, I wasn't afraid. For my sake and Amy's, it was about time I looked forward, not back.
Thank you, Lynn. I'd like to invite, again, Rob up to read from Eckert Review, which is their publishing their monthly or bi-monthly or quarterly or however it works out for them. And I forgot what issue that is.
2011.
2011. I think the reason why I brought that out was because Peter Mankey is the last poet in this, and his wife's artwork is throughout the entire issue. Okay, Rob.
The first poem I want to read is by an author named Millie Chapman, and it's called Widow of the South. She longs for the smell of diesel and barbecue, how it would float into the night, filling the air like dew, while she lay in the beds of big Ford trucks beneath stadium lights, burning the night, attracting bugs. She misses stars that spied from velvet southern skies, watching over her the sweet Christian bell, her empty dip cans, and flasks of Jim Beam. Her mama said, take people to hell. Tired of brunches and afternoon and debutante balls, tired of where her life began, groomed to make the perfect wife, she dropped her perfect life and ran. Thank you. The next piece is a piece by a poet named Liz Argento, and it's called The Sewer. They high-fived as they shut the metal lid above your fingers. I thought you looked so small, your knees against the mossy, grass-stamped wall below us where the murky water slid. Nobody jumped in after the uncool kid who went to fetch their rolling basketball and slunk down dusted concrete, watched it fall in darkness all around you. Brother, I did nothing. I know. At 6, I could not say it, could not stop it. My knees went weak and shook, would not stand to let you see my nervous love. Instead, I rushed away, past laughter and taunts, the nerd, the freak, big brother who always took care of me. Thank you. And the last piece is by Abby L. Shepard, The Magnolia Bar. Midnight marauder of sundresses and loose curls, watching her shoot whiskey for every pang of longing. She's preoccupied with whether he sees that she did her hair or fate-enticing conversation with strangers, an illusion of nonchalance. Midnight marauder, her eyes are swimming in a placebo numbness. She is a fruit soaked in a neon light sun, ripe for the picking. Her lips complain of her desire for stillness and sleeping herself into a pissed-off, sober mourning. Boys rile her passion in a way that always left her head pulsating more than her heart. It was this very routine she was looking forward to, but you, midnight marauder, deferred her private wound licking and dreamless slumber, her magnolias torn for petal so that she would be flowerless. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. And finally, Tracy Bird.
I'm going to give you just a little bit of background from this. My mother was always and one thing that I knew, one of the only things that I knew about her, was that my grandmother, my beloved grandmother, and my beloved grandfather had adopted her in 1945, and that she was the product of an affair between a man who was an American Indian and a woman whose husband was in the Pacific fighting. A few years ago, I decided to reimagine this, how it happened, how my mother came to be. The title of this is Requiem for My Unknown Grandmother. It starts in Salt Lake City in 1944. Would you like another? Caroline raised her head. From outside the window, a throbbing neon light lit her face. She sat at the only table in the come on in. And as he spoke, the man drew up the other chair and seated himself across from her. Whiskey, straight, she said. He left to get her drink. He had a braid that fell to the waistband of his jeans. He wore a cowboy hat. She looked out the window. The same light which painted her face revealed a wet sidewalk in front of the bar, the passing cars, the rinds of grimy snow. "What's your name?" He was back. He'd moved the chair again and now sat on her right, close this time. Her drink was on the table, his fingerprints on the glass, highlighted by the neon flicker. "Caroline." "I'm Reggie. Nice to meet you." He removed his hat and placed it on his knee, then raised his glass. "Yeah, nice to meet you." She reached for her drink. "Your name, that short for something?" "Yes." The man was drinking beer. He'd brought yet another back for himself when he'd gone for her drink. The thin amber liquid absorbed a pulse of light from the sign, held it, and glowed pink. The man said nothing. "For what?" She resented having to draw him out, but she owed him something for the drink. "For the name my mother gave me, the name that gets me beat up in bars and laughed at by ladies, that keeps me from getting work." He raised his glass and drained it. "Why, what are you?" "Ute." "Ute? Like the Indians," Caroline said. "Yeah, like the Indians." Reggie finished the second glass. From the jukebox, Floyd Tillman cried out the GI Blues, and Caroline turned her head to listen. "Dance?" She found it difficult to get up from her chair, but then his hand found hers and she let him lead her, let her weight fall against him. He was tall and her cheekbone rested just below his collarbone. She looked down as they moved together and saw his cowboy boots. Funny, an Indian wearing cowboy boots. But of course they went with the hat, she thought. She was so drunk. But he was strong and supported her easily. After Floyd Tillman came Dinah Shore, and then the Andrews sisters, and they kept dancing until the song ended in the middle, and the lights came up in the bar. "Night, folks, you're done for the evening." The bartender passed them on his way to the door, which he propped open with a length of 2x4. The hot air of the tiny room was released like a breath into the frigid night. "Come home with me?" Reggie said. Caroline didn't remember saying yes, but then they were in his truck and the heater wasn't hot yet. It felt good to lay her cheek against the icy glass of the window in the door. The truck was big and dirty inside, with an empty gun rack in the rear window. Before the heater gave out any warmth, the truck stopped moving. "We're here," he said. They were parked in the rutted driveway of a tiny house missing pieces of its warped shake siding. She could not tell its color in the weak light of the moon. "Wait there, I'll come help you," Reggie said as he opened the door of the truck. He supported her as she navigated the icy and uneven ground. He released her to fumble with his keys at the doorknob, and then they were inside. It was still cold, and the front room was square. It held a twin bed and an oil heater. The light came on, and he offered to take her coat, but she said no, she was cold, and she watched as the oil heater began to glow. They sat side by side, not speaking, until she was warm enough to remove her gloves and fumble with the buttons on her coat. Then he was on top of her, and somehow she was naked. He was heavy and smelled like a wood fire, and he still wore his braid. It fell over his shoulder from where he hung above her and struck her on the cheek just before he came, and then collapsed onto her with a groan. Her hands found their way to his back, and she stroked him there, surprised there was no hair, feeling how broad he was, much broader than Frank. She let herself fall away under his weight, compressed but warm, and then nothing. Caroline woke with a start. She didn't know where she was until she heard Reggie's snores, anchoring her to his bed, his small house. It was dark, but she could see some light around the edges of the large window in the wall across from the bed, a glint on the doorknob. She was so full that it was painful, and she didn't know where to find the bathroom. It was comforting to think of just letting go, emptying her bladder where she lay, pinned between the wall and his bulk, uncovered but warm from the heat of his body, her right foot trapped in a fold of the sheet that was pinned under him. Her head ached with whiskey. She lifted herself by pushing back against the wall until she was free. She climbed over Reggie and her feet found the floor. She could see nothing but found the wall and followed it to a frame for a door and then stepped from wood to a linoleum and struck her hip against the cold metal of some appliance. She waited there against it until forms began to emerge from the dark and she could see the back wall. She moved toward it and fell forward into empty space. Her hand touched a string and she pulled it. The tiny bathroom was lit by a single bare bulb. There was no mirror and no sink, just a tub with the enamel worn off the bottom by the contact of feet. She could find no paper and wiped herself with her hand. It came away wet, both with urine and with what he had emptied into her. The spigot of the tub coughed up loud gusts of air, along with very cold water when she washed her hands. There was no soap that she could see, and she found only a very thin towel, thin but clean, hanging from a nail in the wall. She made her way back to the bed and lay down beside him, and the next time she woke, it was light. I have to go back to the bar. My car, it's there, my sister's car. I have to go back now. What's your name again? Reggie said. He looked at her, and she had the strange feeling she belonged there with him. Caroline. My name's Caroline. She folded her left ring finger back under her thumb and stroked the metal band. Caroline Jessup. You whore! Iris saw the car arrive and was on Caroline before she crossed the threshold of the front door. You'll never change. Caroline didn't respond. She closed the door by throwing her back against it. She felt weak and sick in her stomach. She passed Iris the keys, wanting only to climb the stairs that led up to the room where she'd been sleeping. Look at me. Are you drunk? Answer me. Iris stepped very close, and her voice echoed in the vault of Caroline's head, but it was far away. There was nothing for Caroline to say anyway. She stepped around Iris and climbed to the little bedroom she shared with the oldest girl. Sleep came easily. By the time she made her way downstairs again, Iris was serving dinner to Ezekiel and the kids. She wished she'd stopped in the bathroom to wash her face and clean her mouth. Sensing Ezekiel's eyes on her, she pulled at her clothing, ran her hands through her stringy hair. Aunt Caroline, Evangeline cried with ardor, and attempted to push her chair back from the table. Ezekiel slung an arm behind it and held her there. Iris turned from the stove with a plate of food. Eat something, she said to Caroline, motioning to the stovetop. I should wash my hands. She went back up the stairs to the bathroom. She checked her image in the mirror and brushed the whiskey from her mouth before returning to the kitchen to load a plate with creamed green beans, mashed potatoes, and a cold salad made of green gelatin. The children were released from the table. That meant it was time for the adults to speak. Caroline, Iris began, Ezekiel hanging back in respect of sisterhood. It was only right to let Iris speak first. Ezekiel would break in later. I needed the car this morning, and what if there'd been an emergency with one of the children? I'm sorry. Caroline raised a spoonful of potatoes to her mouth. I know you weren't at the movies. I trusted you and you lied to me, Iris said. I'm sorry. Caroline raised a spoonful of gelatin salad to her mouth. You know, we don't agree with your behavior, Caroline. It was early for Ezekiel to join in. Caroline had learned the pattern in the few weeks she'd spent in their home. She'd arrived just before Thanksgiving, leaving Virginia after Iris's call to beg her to come to Utah to ask for Carolyn's help with a husband, 4 children, to express concern that Carolyn was alone in Virginia. Your behavior, it's not what the Lord wants for you. We've invited you into our home and into the house of the Lord, and you have taken advantage of us and turned your back on him, Ezekiel said. What about Frank? Iris was always the one to bring up Frank. Carolyn thought that was because Ezekiel was here, at home with his family, and Frank, he was somewhere in the Pacific, and he had to go because he had only a wife and no children. She thought this made Ezekiel feel less of a man, even though he was working out at the proving grounds. Ezekiel wouldn't say Frank's name. Caroline knew they were right about her, and they didn't even know about the nights in Virginia. They didn't know about the other men, about how she was so lonely that she couldn't stay at home, and even if she did, she couldn't do it without whiskey, so whiskey was always there. And if not whiskey, wine or rum or anything to make the shabby house on the base feel less empty. They didn't know that all the other wives stayed away because they knew, because sometimes Caroline brought the men back to her house, Frank's house, and because the liquor store delivered. Caroline, we've spoken to the bishop. He's counseled us that you must leave our home. You're not a good influence on the children. Ezekiel's was the voice of authority. Iris might fall into wheedling and pleading, saying that she would help Caroline. How could she help? But Ezekiel could make a decision. And it lay like a thing on the table between them, and Caroline raised the spoon to her mouth, filling it so she would not have to speak. Iris's head was bowed to avoid Caroline's eyes. She might have been praying. Iris dropped Caroline at a motor court that rented rooms by the week, way out on the west side of Salt Lake City, across the street from the Come On In. Carolyn watched the car move away until the taillights pinked with the distance, then picked up her suitcase and headed to the bar. She swung her suitcase into the space under the lone table. Reggie was sitting on a stool, braids centered over the length of his spine, not looking at Caroline. She pulled a bill from her purse and then moved to the bar near Reggie and ordered a whiskey, neat. And as she reached to pay the bartender, Reggie grabbed her wrist and said, "Put it on my tab." And then to her, "Sit." She swung her hip onto a stool and glanced at her suitcase and raised her drink, draining it by half in one long pull. "Another," Reggie said to the bartender, dipping his head toward Caroline. Roy Acuff was singing on the jukebox. Caroline felt the whiskey seeping into her, unknitting the tension in her chest and eyes, and she was so thankful for it. After her third drink, she thought she should head to the motor court, arrange for her room. Instead, she sat on, consuming dutifully the drinks that continued to appear before her until Reggie took her arm and led her out of the bar to his truck, and she had trouble climbing in because it was so tall. Again, she slept pinned against the wall. I left my suitcase at the bar. Reggie was moving about, pulling on his boots. Morning light filled the room. "I have to work," he said. Caroline began sifting through the tangled sheets, searching for her panties, thinking she was being asked to leave. I'll pick it up after work." He pulled a key from his chain and handed it to Caroline and slipped through the front door after instructing her to lock it behind him. She was alone in his house without the company of so much as a book. In the kitchen, she found several cans of Van de Kamp's pork and beans and a paper bag of coffee, and in the refrigerator, an open tin of evaporated milk. She made coffee and ate some beans cold and then returned to bed. Reggie's knock woke her sometime later. He carried her suitcase and a bag of groceries. "Did you go out today?" he asked. "No, I was sleeping." The days began to melt together. Sometimes she and Reggie would go out to the bar. She cooked all the meals and began to pack a lunch for him on the days when he worked. She made arrangements with the man at the motor court to receive her mail, as if she lived there. Frank's letters came every week, and the money too. She didn't wear her wedding ring to the bar anymore, or any time that she was out with Reggie, but she thought of Frank often. She didn't know what to do, where to go. It was so hard to be alone. They drank whiskey every day. If not at the bar, Reggie brought it home. Caroline felt so tired all the time, and only the whiskey made the tired go away, and the days slipped past. It was some weeks before she became concerned, before she realized she hadn't had her monthlies for a while. There was no mirror in the house, but one night she went into the bathroom at the bar and pulled up her shirt, and she could see that her belly was different, rounder and firmer. And in that very moment, she knew it was a girl. She said nothing to Reggie. She went to the charity hospital rather than seeking out a doctor on the base at Dugway. She told them she was unmarried, alone. They gave her coupons for food, for milk and eggs and meat, even though she had money. Frank's checks and his letters continued to come, forwarded on to the motor court by Iris, who by now knew that Carolyn wasn't living there. And each week Caroline wrote to Frank. She wrote from Reggie's little clapboard house and sent the letters to the base in Virginia. They went on from there, envelopes bearing Iris's address in the upper left-hand corner, letters filled with anecdotes about the children, how much Carolyn was needed here, and descriptions of Salt Lake City, of the Mormon temple, and the mountains changing from winter to spring. Is it mine? Reggie asked when at last he noticed or felt need to mention Caroline's condition. Yes. Carolyn's belly strained the fabric of her dress now. Her panties sat low on her hips beneath the arc of her abdomen. How do you know? Reggie prodded. The doctor says January, Reggie, and I haven't seen my husband since July. She didn't mention the other men in Virginia. Reggie never asked about Frank, but she'd let slip the fact that he was a corpsman, that he was stationed somewhere in the Pacific, and she could not be told where. She had let slip because she felt guilty about Reggie and the others and about living like this, and now, of course, about the baby. Still, she didn't know what else she could do. Reggie began going to the bar after working, coming home late and drunk, and Carolyn seemed always to be alone in the house. She couldn't go out much because everyone could see the baby now. Reggie picked up her letters from the motor court, and Carolyn bought her whiskey at the liquor store next to the grocery, and he did not touch her now, but neither did he ask her to leave. It was October, and she was describing the change in the mountains in a letter to Frank, how summer was turning to fall in the Wasatch when the pains began. She poured herself another whiskey and finished the letter, addressed and stamped it. She put her light Virginia coat on, and now it would not button around her. She put the letter in her pocket next to the papers for the adoption agent and her wedding ring, and picked up her suitcase. She had packed weeks before, all the clothes she could wear before the baby, and she left the little clapboard house, locking the door and leaving the key on the sill above it. A concerned man in a paneled station wagon picked her up at the corner and drove her to the charity hospital. Later, years later, she would wonder, but she would never know if Frank could tell, if the changes in her body told him where she'd been while he was patching together bodies on a battlefield somewhere. She would never know, and she would never have another child.
Okay, thank you very much, Tracy. Just a couple of things. Remember, $5 donation to the basket. That helps this organization survive. I'd like to thank Kurt Thompson, Martha Muzzy. I also would like to thank BOCA Bay GRILLE and our participants today, Allison Solomon, Tracy Bird, Lynn Taylor, Rob McCabe, Michael Guittard, and Sandy. Also like to thank our server, Tiffany, please. Always remember Tiffany. I hope you enjoyed your food and your beverage and our song and dance today. I also have just a couple of quick announcements. Tonight is an open mic at the Blueberry Patch. Also, June 4th, we'll be hosting or showcasing John Steinbeck's works. So if anyone is interested, please contact Martha. And remember, every Saturday is Volunteer Day, beginning at 11 a.m. At the Blueberry Patch. Yes, Rob?
And tonight, there's an open mic night at Iberian Rooster in downtown St. Leon Central.
Okay,
It
and
starts at 7 o'clock and runs till 9:30, so it's poetry.
did everyone hear that? Wonderful. All right, thank you very much, and I hope to see you next month.
Thank you, Ian.